Keir Starmer is in serious trouble. His leadership, once touted as the Labour Party's great revival, is now on the verge of collapse. His bold push for welfare cuts has backfired spectacularly, triggering a full-blown rebellion within his own ranks. 80 Labour MPs have openly defied him, an astonishing number that cannot simply be dismissed as minor dissent. These are not just fringe backbenchers making noise. Some of the most influential figures in the party have turned against him, seeing his policies as a betrayal of Labour's core values. But here's what's truly shocking. Starmer thought he could force his agenda through without resistance, believing his authority was beyond question. He underestimated the outrage, not only from his own MPs but from the very voters who once saw him as Labour's best chance at redemption. The Labour heartlands, those red wall constituencies that helped rebuild the party after the catastrophic 2019 defeat, now feel utterly betrayed. Starmer promised fairness, stability, and a return to Labour's roots. Instead, they see a leader siding with the elite, punishing the working class, and offering nothing but hollow rhetoric. And while Labour is imploding, Britain is spiralling into a crisis of its own. The country is witnessing a total collapse of border control. Over 2,000 illegal migrants have arrived in just 10 days, overwhelming the system and leaving the government scrambling for answers. The asylum process is at breaking point, public services are stretched to the limit, and local communities are seeing entire neighborhoods transformed overnight, without any say in the matter. So where is Starmer in all this? Why is he refusing to take a stand? Silence. Dodging. Evasion. Instead of confronting the crisis head-on, Starmer has chosen to bury his head in the sand, hoping no one will notice. He refuses to support tougher measures to stop the endless flow of illegal crossings. Worse still, he opposes the government's plan to deport migrants to Rwanda, the only real attempt at curbing this disaster. But if he scraps this plan, what is his alternative? What does Starmer actually propose? Nothing. Not a single concrete solution, just the same tired platitudes that the British public has heard over and over again. The numbers don't lie. This crisis is spiraling out of control. Criminal networks are exploiting Britain's weak border policies, smuggling in thousands under the guise of asylum seekers. Security experts are warning of potential terrorist infiltration, yet Starmer and his party continue to look the other way. And the financial cost? Absolutely staggering. Britain is now spending billions to house, feed, and process these illegal migrants. Hotels, once used for tourists and business travelers, have been seized to accommodate them, displacing local residents in the process. Communities are changing overnight, and public resources are being drained faster than the government can replenish them. The NHS is crumbling, schools are overrun, and housing shortages are worsening. Yet, taxpayers are being forced to foot the bill. And still, the government does nothing. Day after day, boats continue to arrive on British shores, packed with migrants who have paid thousands to people smugglers for a guaranteed route into the UK. Once they land, many disappear without a trace, no background checks, no documentation, no way to track them. How is this acceptable? How is Britain allowing this to happen? Meanwhile, Starmer is too busy trying to silence dissent within his own party to address this national catastrophe. Reports indicate that Labour leadership is threatening MPs who oppose him with deselection, essentially pushing them out of the party if they refuse to fall in line. But instead of instilling fear, this strong-arm tactic is only fueling more defiance. Even MPs who were once loyal to Starmer are now beginning to question whether he is fit to lead. The Conservatives are seizing the moment, using Starmer's weakness to their advantage. Rishi Sunak's government is hammering Labour for failing to offer a clear immigration policy, and they're right to do so. At the same time, Reform UK is rising. Nigel Farage's party has capitalised on the frustration of voters who feel abandoned by both Labour and the Tories. The idea that working-class Labour voters might defect to a party campaigning on stricter immigration policies would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. But now, it's happening. And here's the real problem for Starmer: he is trapped. If he toughens Labour's stance on immigration, he risks alienating the progressive wing of his party, which has long pushed for looser border controls. If he stays silent, he will continue hemorrhaging support from traditional Labour voters who demand real action. Either way, Labour is imploding. The polls are already shifting. Labour, once confident of a landslide victory, is now seeing its support erode. And Starmer's personal ratings? At their lowest point since he became leader. Voters see him as indecisive, out of touch, and incapable of handling real crises. His robotic responses in Parliament, his lack of charisma, and his failure to connect with ordinary Britons are making it painfully clear he is not the leader Britain needs. And now, the whispers of a Labour coup are growing louder. Senior Labour MPs and insiders are reportedly questioning whether Starmer is even the right person to lead the party into the next general election. If this crisis escalates further, a leadership challenge before the election is not out of the question. So what happens next? Will Starmer continue to pretend the migrant crisis isn't real? Will he keep suppressing his own MPs instead of addressing the anger of British voters? Or will Labour finally wake up and realise that, under Starmer, they are heading for disaster? One thing is clear: Britain is at a breaking point. The migrant crisis is spiralling, national security is at risk, and public faith in the government is plummeting. If Starmer cannot show real leadership now, his career may be over before the next election even begins. The question is no longer if Starmer's leadership will collapse. The question is when. The United Kingdom is facing a crisis of staggering proportions, and yet those in power refuse to act. While Labour descends into civil war over Keir Starmer's catastrophic welfare cuts, another disaster is spiralling out of control, one that threatens national security, economic stability, and the very fabric of British society. Illegal migration has exploded, with over 2,000 migrants arriving in just 10 days, and the government seems utterly incapable of stopping it. Day after day, small boats continue to cross the channel, packed with migrants who have paid criminal smugglers thousands of pounds to facilitate their journey. The government claims it is taking action, but the reality tells a very different story. The footage is there for all to see: migrants landing on British shores, walking into the country unchallenged, vanishing into the system with no documentation, no background checks, and no way to track them. And what is Starmer's response to this national emergency? Silence. Deflection. Weakness. He refuses to address the problem, refuses to acknowledge its consequences, and most damning of all, refuses to offer a solution. Instead, he actively opposes measures that could actually curb the crisis. He has denounced the government's Rwanda deportation plan, the only real deterrent in place to stop the boats. But if he scraps it, what is his alternative? He has none. This is not just about numbers. This is about national security. Experts have repeatedly warned that Britain's broken border system is a gift to criminal networks, human traffickers, drug cartels, and yes, even terrorist organizations. Authorities have admitted they have no control over who is entering the country, and intelligence reports suggest that suspected extremists and dangerous criminals are slipping through the cracks. If you think that sounds alarmist, consider this: how many of those arriving have been properly vetted? How many have criminal records that remain undiscovered? And how many are already planning to exploit Britain's weak security for their own gain? The financial burden of this crisis is astronomical. The UK taxpayer is now footing a multi-billion-pound bill to house, feed, and process tens of thousands of illegal migrants who continue to pour in. Hotels that once welcomed tourists and business travelers have been seized by the government and transformed into migrant accommodation centers. Entire communities are being radically changed overnight, with local councils warning that public services are being pushed beyond their limits. Schools are overwhelmed, housing shortages are worsening, and the NHS, already on the brink of collapse, is facing an even greater strain as resources are diverted away from British citizens. And what do ordinary Britons get in return? Higher taxes. A cost of living crisis that shows no signs of easing. Communities flooded with migrants who entered illegally and are now being prioritized over those who have contributed to this country their entire lives. People are angry, and rightly so. Across the country, protests are erupting, with local residents demanding answers from a government that has abandoned them. And yet, Starmer and Labour refuse to listen. For years, Labour positioned itself as the party of compassion, arguing for a more humane approach to immigration. But when does compassion become self-destruction? The reality is that Britain's immigration system is broken beyond repair, and Starmer's refusal to take action is making the situation far worse. Even within his own party, Labour MPs are starting to panic. Some fear that if Labour doesn't address this issue, they will lose working-class voters for good. Others, locked into their ideological bubble, refuse to budge, insisting that the solution is to make it even easier for migrants to come to the UK. The party is split, and Starmer is too weak to take a decisive stance. The Conservatives, desperate to regain control of the narrative, are hammering Starmer at every opportunity. "What is your plan?" they ask. "How will you stop the boats?" And Starmer, no answer, no strategy, just empty criticism. Meanwhile, Reform UK is rising. Nigel Farage's influence is growing once again, with his party capitalising on the sense of betrayal felt by millions of voters. Traditional Labour supporters, those who would never have imagined voting for an anti-immigration party, are now shifting their allegiance. Because when a crisis reaches this scale, when communities are pushed to the brink, when crime, instability, and economic turmoil become the norm, loyalty to a party means nothing compared to the survival of a nation. The situation is now so dire that even law enforcement officials are sounding the alarm. Reports indicate that criminal gangs are thriving under Britain's lax border controls, using the migrant crisis to smuggle people, drugs, and weapons into the country. MI5 and counter-terrorism units are already stretched thin, dealing with a growing number of security threats both domestic and foreign. Now, with thousands of undocumented individuals entering the UK every month, the risk of a major security failure is terrifyingly real. Other nations have already woken up to this threat. Across Europe, governments are tightening border controls, implementing strict deportation policies, and prioritizing the safety of their citizens. And yet, Britain lags behind, paralyzed by political cowardice and leaders too afraid to take a firm stand. How much longer can this go on? How much more pressure can Britain withstand before something snaps? The longer Westminster refuses to act, the greater the risk of social unrest. Communities feel abandoned. Local councils are breaking under the strain. Crime rates are rising. Public confidence in the government is collapsing. And all the while, Starmer stays silent, hoping the problem will go away. But the British people see what is happening. And they are running out of patience. The next general election will not be fought on the same tired political battles of the past. This time, the stakes are far higher. The defining issues for voters will be border security, crime, the economy, and national identity. And here's the brutal reality for Starmer: if he fails to act now, he will lose. His leadership is already fragile. His approval ratings are plummeting. And whispers of a Labour rebellion are growing louder by the day. Many within the party are already questioning whether Starmer has what it takes to win, or whether he is leading Labour straight into electoral disaster. The cracks are widening. The rebellion is growing. The British public is watching, and they are demanding action. If Starmer continues down this path, his downfall is inevitable. The only question is how long it will take for his own party to turn on him. Keir Starmer is trapped, and the walls are closing in fast. The migrant crisis is spiralling out of control, the British public is outraged, and Labour is fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. Across the country, protests are breaking out. Communities feel abandoned, betrayed by a government that refuses to protect its own borders. And yet, the man who claims he's ready to be Prime Minister remains paralysed, unable to take a clear stance, unable to lead. How did we get here? How did Starmer allow Labour to reach this breaking point? The answer is simple: he thought he could play both sides, but now he's pleasing no one. His party is split down the middle. If he takes a tougher stance on immigration, he enrages Labour's progressive wing, which has spent years championing open borders and relaxed policies. But if he does nothing, he risks losing the traditional working-class voters who are demanding real action. Either way, he's bleeding support, and he's running out of time to stop the hemorrhage. The Conservatives smell blood in the water. Rishi Sunak and his ministers are going on the offensive, exposing Starmer's glaring lack of a plan and hammering home one brutal message: Labour is not ready to govern. And they have a point. What exactly is Labour's stance on illegal migration? No one knows. Starmer refuses to say. He dodges questions, he deflects blame, but he never actually proposes a solution. And the British public has had enough. Meanwhile, Reform UK is surging. Nigel Farage's movement is attracting disillusioned voters from both major parties, offering a simple, uncompromising message: take back control of Britain's borders. Just a decade ago, the idea that traditional Labour supporters, working-class Brits who once saw Labour as their champion, would flock to an anti-immigration party was unthinkable. But now, it's happening. And Labour is too arrogant, or too blind, to see why. But the real danger for Starmer isn't just public outrage. It's the growing rebellion within his own party. Labour MPs are losing patience, and they're starting to turn against their leader. Private meetings have become heated battlegrounds, with frustrated MPs confronting Starmer directly over his failure to address the crisis. And now, the infighting is spilling into the public eye. Leaks, recordings, off-the-record briefings to the press. This is how a party begins to collapse. Even Starmer's closest allies are struggling to defend him. The party line used to be simple: blame the Tories, attack the government. But that's no longer enough. Voters want solutions, not excuses. And Labour isn't offering any. The unions, once Labour's most powerful backers, are also turning on Starmer. He has failed to stand up for striking workers, failed to challenge big business interests, and failed to deliver on his promises to the left. The cracks in his leadership are widening, and with every misstep, the possibility of a full-scale coup within Labour grows stronger. And let's not forget the shadow looming over all of this: a possible leadership challenge. The whispers are getting louder. Senior figures within the party are questioning whether Starmer is the right person to lead them into the next election. The numbers are shifting. The public is turning against him. His own MPs are plotting in the background. If Labour doesn't act soon, they could enter the next general election as a divided, directionless party, torn between factions that despise one another. And history has shown us what happens to parties in that position: they lose. So here's the question: how much longer can Starmer survive? His approval ratings are sinking. His party is fracturing. The public has lost confidence in him. And the rebellion within Labour is only getting stronger. If the party does not act soon, Keir Starmer's downfall may be inevitable. Keir Starmer's leadership is hanging by a thread. The illusion of control, of stability, has shattered. What was once a party poised to seize power is now a fractured movement, bleeding support from all sides. And at the center of it all stands a leader who can no longer command the confidence of his own ranks, let alone the British public. The numbers are brutal. Labour's once comfortable lead in the polls is crumbling. Starmer's approval ratings have plummeted to their lowest point since he took office, and the whispers of discontent within his own party have grown into open mutiny. Voters who once saw him as a viable alternative to Conservative rule now see a man devoid of charisma, incapable of decisive action, and utterly unprepared to lead Britain through its mounting crises. And let's be clear, it's not just the electorate that has lost faith in Starmer. Inside Parliament, the cracks are widening. The Tory frontbench has humiliated him time and time again in the Commons, exposing his lack of clear policies, his indecision, and his failure to answer even the most basic questions about how Labour would govern. Rishi Sunak and his ministers have torn him apart in debate, reducing his responses to bland, scripted talking points that offer nothing new, nothing concrete, nothing that reassures the British public. But Starmer's greatest weakness is not how he performs against the Conservatives. It's how he is losing the support of his own party. Labour MPs are getting restless. Many who once stood firmly behind him are now openly questioning his ability to lead them into the next general election. Some are demanding a shift in policy, others are quietly discussing the nuclear option, replacing him altogether before the country goes to the polls. The possibility of a leadership challenge before the next election is no longer unthinkable. It is actively being considered. The internal rebellion has been brewing for months, but the migrant crisis has pushed tensions to breaking point. The public is furious. Communities are overwhelmed. The government has lost control of Britain's borders, and yet Starmer has no response, no plan, no vision for how to stop the chaos. Labour MPs have been grilled by their own constituents, asked to explain why their leader refuses to take a stance on illegal migration, why he continues to evade the question, dodging real answers at every turn. The unions, once Labour's greatest allies, are beginning to lose patience too. Starmer's failure to support striking workers, his cosy relationships with corporate interests, his inability to take a strong stance on economic policy, all of it has eroded his credibility with the very institutions that once kept the party afloat. And then there's the Conservative Party, circling like vultures. Sunak, desperate to shift the narrative away from his own party's failings, has seized every opportunity to attack Starmer's inaction. His message is simple and devastating: Labour has no plan. Labour is not ready to govern. Starmer is weak. And the worst part, he's not wrong. But perhaps the biggest threat to Starmer's leadership isn't coming from the Tories. It's coming from Reform UK. Nigel Farage's movement is gaining momentum at an alarming pace, eating into the working-class vote that Labour once took for granted. Traditional Labour supporters, disgusted by Starmer's refusal to confront the migrant crisis, are abandoning the party in droves. The idea that working-class voters would back a party built on strict immigration policies would have been laughable a decade ago. But now, it's a reality Labour refuses to acknowledge. And let's be clear about what's at stake. If Starmer continues down this path of political cowardice, if he refuses to address the concerns of the British people, then Labour is heading for disaster. The party is already hemorrhaging support from both its traditional base and the centre-left voters who once saw Starmer as a safe pair of hands. The British public is demanding leadership, strong, decisive action in a time of crisis. But what is Starmer offering? Hesitation, vague promises, a refusal to engage with the issues that matter most to voters. And this is where the real danger lies. If Labour enters the next election divided, leaderless, and without a coherent policy on the biggest issues facing the country, they will lose, and they will lose badly. The question now is not if Starmer's leadership will collapse, but when. Labour's internal divisions are getting worse, not better. Senior figures are growing increasingly vocal about their doubts. Some are already preparing for what comes after Starmer, exploring potential successors who can rebuild Labour's credibility before it's too late. But time is running out. The election is approaching. The public is watching. The cracks in Labour's foundation are turning into fractures. If Starmer does not act, if he does not take a stand, show leadership, and prove that he is capable of governing, then the party will make the decision for him. And when that happens, the fall of Keir Starmer will be swift, brutal, and inevitable.